Hello, Philosophans. This is Thinkbomb number 3. Why do people philosophize? And I'm Professor Brian W. Van Norden. I think there's a common misconception that philosophy is only something you do when you're, and pardon the expression, BSing, right? So you have a few glasses of wine, maybe you smoke a little something mind altering, and then you're like, yeah, man, like, what is the meaning of life, man? The reality is quite different. The best philosophy in every culture around the world starts when people are faced with some kind of crisis and they're looking for a way out of this crisis and a serious solution to a serious problem, and that's why they engage in philosophy. So let's look at a couple cultures to illustrate this point. Now, philosophy, of course, developed in several different cultures around the world. And Socrates is not the first philosopher in the Western tradition, but he's certainly one of the most famous. Now, Socrates was a real historical individual. He was a war hero. He was known for his heroism during the Peloponnesian War, in which he fought on the Athenian side. By trade, he was a stonemason, but he became notorious in Athens, where he lived, for going around and starting conversations with people, especially people who claimed to be knowledgeable about things. And he would ask them to define their terms. So people who said that they were very pious when it came to religion, he'd ask them, what is piety? Or people who had a reputation for justice, he'd say, okay, you're a just person. What is justice? And there's many respects in which ancient Athenian society was a lot like our own. For example, actors were taken very seriously in ancient Athenian society, and people assumed that actors knew something because of this miraculous ability they had to act. But Socrates would talk to them and ask them questions and reveal that the actors were actually very ignorant. Some people were rich, and because they were rich, either because they inherited wealth or they'd earned wealth, they thought they were wise, and other people thought they were wise. But Socrates would ask them to give a rational account of why they believed what they did, and they couldn't give it. Other people were orators or statesmen who had a reputation for wisdom. And again, Socrates would puncture their arrogance by showing that they really didn't know what they thought they knew. And Socrates said, look, I'm not wise, but at least I, Socrates, know that I know nothing. Whereas other people think that they know something when they really don't. So my wisdom, Socrates says, consists in knowing that I know nothing. Socrates also said that the unexamined life is not worth living for a human. So again, he wasn't just going around asking people questions for the sake of asking questions. He thought that if you're a human being, what distinguishes a human being from a dog or a cat or a cow or an inanimate object is that a human can examine their own life and ask questions. And so what really makes life worth living, Socrates said, was asking questions and examining yourself and others. He thought it would make you a better person if you asked questions about the nature of justice and the nature of courage, even if all you learned about that was that you didn't know as much as you thought you knew before. Now, going around asking people a bunch of hard questions made Socrates a bunch of enemies. And eventually, people trumped up charges that he was corrupting the youth by challenging conventional religious beliefs and inquiring into things that people shouldn't ask about. In some ways, Socrates ran afoul of the same cultural conservatives that college professors encounter in the United States today. It said that college professors are corrupting the youth, when really mostly what most of us are doing is just teaching students to think and to ask questions and inviting them to question some of their assumptions. But supposedly that's corrupting the youth. Same thing with Socrates. He was accused of corrupting the youth. Most historians would say he really wasn't doing the things he was accused of doing, not actually corrupting the youth, although he was asking hard questions of people. But in any case, he was found guilty by the jury, and he was sentenced to death by being forced to drink hemlock. And this is a famous painting done centuries later, The Death of Socrates by the great painter Jacques-Louis David, and it's rife with symbolism. You can see Socrates is just being handed the cup of hemlock, which he's being forced to drink as a form of capital punishment. Socrates is really buff here. I kind of doubt that the actual historical Socrates was this ripped, but maybe he was. What do I know? I'm just jealous. And notice he's gesturing upward, because supposedly on the day that he died, Socrates discussed with his friends and argued philosophically, claiming that you could prove that the immortal soul will survive the death of the body, and that it's actually a benefit for the soul to be freed of being in the body. So he's gesturing upwards, telling his friends, don't cry, I know you're sad, but it's okay because I'm going to a better place when my soul is freed from my body. Well, this is a wonderfully symbolic painting, and there's a great YouTube video by NerdWriter1. I'll link to it in the description, but you can also find it under the name NerdWriter1, The Death of Socrates, How to Read a Painting, which discusses the beautiful composition and symbolism of this painting. So Socrates thought that asking questions was worth doing because it's what distinguishes a human who can examine their life and ask questions from an animal. And it'll help you to recognize the limitations of your own knowledge and therefore live better. One of the young people, comparatively young, who was very influenced by Socrates was this guy by the name of Plato. And Plato was horrified that his society, Athenian society, would execute someone as virtuous and courageous, a known war hero, like Socrates, who was just going around asking questions. But Plato felt that both political wings in Athens at the time, the democratic wing, small d democratic, the pro-democracy Athenians, but also the pro-authoritarian Athenians, both wings were corrupt. And so Socrates was led to philosophize, again, not by just abstract curiosity or a desire to BS about things, but Plato, who became one of the most rigorous philosophers in the Western tradition, was led to philosophize, as he explains in his 7th letter, by horror at the corruption he saw in Athenian society. So Plato said, after describing all the corruption in society and how they'd unfairly executed his friend Socrates, Plato says, finally it became clear to me, with regard to all existing communities, that they were one and all misgoverned, for their laws have got into a state that is almost incurable. And I was forced to say, when praising true philosophy, that it is by this that men are enabled to see what justice in public and private life really is. Therefore, I said, there will be no cessation of evils for the sons of men, till either those who are pursuing a right and true philosophy receive sovereign power in the states, or those in power in the states, by some dispensation of providence, become true philosophers. So Plato was led to philosophize by the belief that the way to solve corruption in society was by getting true philosophers, people who were truly committed to the love of wisdom and living well, into positions of government authority, or by reforming people in positions of authority to become true philosophers. So again, he's really got a very practical motivation for his philosophizing. And he tells us in a letter that survives to this day, the 7th letter. It's a fascinating letter for a bunch of reasons. I encourage you to read it. So Socrates was led to ask questions because he thought that you lead a better life as a human if you know the limitations of your own knowledge. And also he thought that at least, even if you just know that you know nothing, that's better than thinking you know something when you don't know it. But like contemporary college professors, he was accused of corrupting the youth for getting young people to think. And he inspired Plato, who became one of the most influential philosophers in the Western tradition. And Plato set up a school called the Academy in Athens. And among the students who came to study under Plato at the Academy was a young aristocrat, Aristotle, who had connections with the family of Alexander the Great, who would go on to become very famous in his own right. And Aristotle eventually became the tutor to Alexander the Great, who went on to conquer uh, almost all of the known world. And Alexander's forces actually got as far as parts of India. There are descendants of Alexander the Great soldiers in parts of, well, anyway, northwest South Asia. Maybe not part of India today, but parts of South Asia. And Alexander the Great was a student of the great Aristotle, who was himself a student of Plato, who was himself a follower of Socrates. And Aristotle also emphasized the way in which philosophy can inform both politics and ethics. So again, philosophy is not about abstract theorizing divorced from consequences. It's about addressing real problems in your society. Well, is that just distinctive of Anglo-European philosophy, which goes back to figures like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle? No. Let's go to the other side of the world. At about the same time, we're in the later half of the Zhou dynasty in China. And this is me at the Hubei Provincial Museum in Wuhan, China. And I'm in front of this wonderful collection of ceremonial bells that was unearthed not too long ago. And these bells date from around 433 BCE, which is in the latter part of the Zhou dynasty. And in 433 BCE, Socrates would have been in early middle age, and Plato was just a few years away from being born. So what was going on in Zhou dynasty China? Well, there was a Zhou dynasty king. That's why it's the Zhou dynasty, because the Zhou were the reigning family. And so there was a Zhou dynasty king, but the Zhou dynasty king reigned, but by this point in history, the Zhou dynasty king did not rule. Real power in China in this period, and the Warring States period is a period towards the end of the Zhou dynasty. Real power in this period was in the hands of the rulers of the states into which China was divided. So China was divided into these states, usually run by a duke. Each duke would make their own laws, raise their own taxes, have their own army. And because the Zhou king no longer had centralized authority, the rulers of the various states would compete with one another and fight wars against each other. And the rulers of the states had to tax the peasants very high to pay for their wars of conquest. And even if you were wealthy or influential, you didn't feel safe because someone might try to steal your wealth. Or if you were the duke, your children might try to kill you to assume the dukedom, or your prime minister might betray you. So everyone suffered in this period. This is a close-up map of what the states looked like at a certain point in the Warring States period in the latter half of the Zhou dynasty. This is what, more or less, what those states looked like on a map with the contemporary political boundaries. You can see where China is on this map. That's the Korean peninsula off to the northeast. Just outside the map is Japan, which is pretty close to the Korean peninsula. North of China is Mongolia. North of that, you get into Russia. And of course, if you go to the west, you get to India. So what was it like in the Warring States period when all the states were fighting for supremacy, peasants were being taxed to pay for wars of conquest, even wealthy and influential people couldn't be sure of not being murdered? An ancient work, the Tao Te Ching, the classic of the way and virtue attributed to Lao Tzu, the supposed founder of Taoism, describes the situation. The court is resplendent, yet the fields are overgrown. The granaries are empty, yet some wear elegant clothes. Fine swords dangle at their sides. They are stuffed with food and drink, and possess wealth and abundance. This is known as taking pride in robbery. Far is this from the way. What is the way? The way is the right way to live and the right way to organize society. And why were philosophers looking to find the way in their society? They were doing it because society had lost the way. People were vicious. Governments were corrupt. People were taking advantage of other individuals. People in government were not governing for the well-being of the common people. And as a result, a variety of philosophical schools of thought developed. Sometimes people talk about the 100 schools of thought during this ancient period, but a later historian, Sima Tan, organized them into 6 major schools. And his son, Sima Qian, wrote a classic historical work which included this essay by his father, Sima Tan, and it became one of the classic statements of the major philosophical schools in ancient China. And according to him, there were 6. Legalism, and I'm greatly oversimplifying these, of course, but just to give you a feel for this, according to legalism, the way is to govern by clear laws and bureaucratic rules that are strictly enforced with severe punishments for violations and great rewards for compliance. The school of names claim that the way is expressed in paradoxes, like white horses are not horses. The yin-yang school said that the way is based on complementary opposites, yin and yang, and 5 phases that things go through in a cyclical way over time: water, metal, wood, fire, and earth. So water, metal, wood, fire, and earth are not elements, they're phases that things go through cyclically. According to Moism, founded by Mozi, the way is to promote wealth, populousness, and social order through impartially caring for the well-being of everybody and acting on that impartial caring. According to Confucianism, the way is to cultivate virtues in individuals who can then become government officials. Structurally kind of similar to Plato's proposal that the way to solve Athens' problems was to cultivate virtue in individuals and get those virtuous individuals into positions of government authority. But then Taoism argued, and again, I'm really oversimplifying very complex movements here, but Taoism argued that the way is to avoid artificial interference in natural processes. And so Taoists tend to think that the effort to cultivate virtue almost automatically leads to pretentiousness and self-righteousness and artifice instead of genuine virtue. Now, of these 6 major schools, only Confucianism and Taoism survived from the ancient period and continued to be influential. And then later, Buddhist missionaries came from India along the Silk Road and brought Buddhism to China, where it became influential. So in the long term in Chinese history, people talk about the 3 teachings: Buddhism, which had been imported from India, and then Taoism and Confucianism, which had their origin in China. And Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism then went on to become influential in Korea, in Vietnam, which, although it's part of Southeast Asia, was very influenced by East Asian philosophical ideas, and also in Japan, because as we saw, Japan's very close actually to the Korean peninsula. But the key thing to remember here is, again, these philosophies arose because people were in a difficult social situation and they were trying to solve the problems that they faced. So why do people philosophize? And I've given you 2 examples, but this is true wherever we see philosophy in the world, whether it's Africa or the indigenous Americas or anywhere else in the world. People start to philosophize in response to serious personal or social crises. So, to understand a philosopher you're reading, you need to know what problem is their philosophy a response to, and why are they so worried about this problem. If you read a philosopher and you don't know why they care about the position they're defending, you don't understand that philosopher. And as a teacher, I often think about the fact that we live in a very chaotic, difficult social context right now. Whatever your political persuasion, you agree there are a lot of problems that our civilization faces. And, I worry about that and it bothers me too. But then there's another part of me that thinks, hey, which of the students sitting in my class right now are going to go on to become the next Plato or the next Nagarjuna or the next Shantideva or the next Zara Jacob or the next Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X, or Hu Shi. So difficult times produce great philosophy. So in a way, I'm really excited looking forward to what the world has in store for us philosophically. So if you enjoyed this video, please become a Philosophan by liking this video, subscribing to this channel, and leaving me a comment to know what you think. I'd also like to invite you to look at my website, brianvannorden.com, which has syllabi and a bibliography of multicultural philosophy and some links to some other videos which you might find important. And as you can hear in the background, my cat, Pinky Ann, would also like you very much to like, subscribe, and comment. I look forward to seeing you next time.